On March 12, 2026, a fire broke out in the aft laundry room of USS Gerald R. Ford. It was not a combat casualty. No Iranian missile, no drone strike, no enemy action of any kind. Faulty electrics in a ship's laundry, the kind of failure that happens aboard vessels operated at sustained high tempo for months beyond their designed maintenance cycles. The fire spread through adjacent areas. Approximately 100 sleeping berths were destroyed. Roughly 200 sailors were treated for smoke exposure. At least one required medical evacuation. The Navy confirmed 2 injuries were non-life-threatening. CENTCOM confirmed propulsion was unaffected. The carrier remained operationally capable. The ship had been continuously deployed for 272 days when the fire started. It had covered 4 separate theaters: Europe, Venezuela, the Mediterranean, and the Red Sea. Since departing Naval Station Norfolk on June 24, 2025, it was burning through the longest U.S. carrier deployment since the end of the Vietnam War and was still weeks away from breaking the record. It had sewage systems clogged with calcium buildup, requiring quarterly acid flushes. It had EMALS, electromagnetic catapults, running at a fraction of their designed reliability intervals. It had a crew that had been at sea for 9 months without the maintenance window the ship's engineering schedule required. And a fire destroyed a significant portion of its berthing. The obvious response to all of that, to the fire, to the 9 months of deferred maintenance, to the sewage failures and the EMALS strain, and the 200 sailors treated for smoke inhalation, is to send the ship home. Let the sailors rest. Let the yards work. Let the most advanced carrier ever built receive the maintenance its $13 billion design requires after the most demanding deployment it has ever faced. The Navy did not send it home. 5 days in Split, Croatia. Repairs patched. Crew returned. Ford declared combat ready. Sent back to the Red Sea. The question that Virginia Senators Mark Warner and Tim Kaine asked in a formal letter to the Secretary of the Navy on March 19, 2026, 1 week after the fire, was the same question every family member of every sailor aboard was asking. Why couldn't it come home? The answer is not a single decision. It is a system of constraints that each individually seem manageable and collectively make sending the Ford home operationally impossible. Understanding those constraints is understanding the real cost of the Navy's carrier posture in the spring of 2026. The math starts with a congressional mandate. The 2011 law requiring a minimum of 11 active aircraft carriers was written specifically because Congress decided that fewer than 11 represented an unacceptable risk to American global power projection. 11 is the floor. Below 11, the Navy is legally non-compliant with its own force structure requirements. In March 2026, the carrier inventory looked like this. USS Ronald Reagan was in a 17-month overhaul at Puget Sound Naval Shipyard that began in August 2025. USS Harry S. Truman was undergoing repair work at Norfolk ahead of its own availability period. USS Dwight D. Eisenhower was in availability after its 2024 deployment. USS Nimitz was completing what everyone thought would be its final transit, heading to Norfolk for decommissioning before the service extension was announced. USS John F. Kennedy, the Ford-class ship scheduled to replace Nimitz in the fleet count, would not be commissioned until March 2027. 3 carriers in CENTCOM: Ford, Abraham Lincoln, and George H.W. Bush on approach. George Washington Forward deployed at Yokosuka, Japan, unavailable for independent deployment. Theodore Roosevelt, completing training cycles. John C. Stennis in availability. Carl Vinson in overhaul sequence. 3 in the Middle East, 1 in Japan. several in maintenance or training. The floor of 11 was being maintained by the mathematical skin of the fleet's teeth. Sending Ford home in March 2026 meant one fewer carrier in CENTCOM during the largest U.S. air campaign since the Gulf War, with Project Freedom not yet announced and the strait not yet reopened, and Abraham Lincoln, the only remaining strike group positioned to cover the entire operational picture from the Arabian Sea. The geometry of the carrier fleet made sending Ford home equivalent to cutting the theater's available carrier aviation by half at the moment when the ceasefire negotiations had not yet produced a political settlement, and Iran was still contesting the strait with mines, drones, and fast boats. The ship could not come home because there was nothing to replace it. If you watch this channel, you know the press release and the fleet count are two different documents. The Navy said Gerald Ford was combat ready. The fleet count tells you why it had no choice but to say that. What follows is the maintenance and industrial record that neither statement addresses, and why it was already on Beijing's desk before the fire started. Chinese naval analysts had been tracking the Ford's deployment timeline since its arrival in the Red Sea Theater in late 2025. What they documented was not the ship's combat power. That was publicly reported. What they noted was the maintenance equation. A Ford-class carrier requires a post-deployment availability of 12 to 18 months after a standard cycle. A Ford-class carrier kept at sea for 300-plus days without that availability accumulates a debt that cannot be patched in 5 days at a Croatian pier. The PLA Navy's carriers, Liaoning and Shandong, have never deployed for more than 40 days. Their analysts understand precisely what a 314-day deployment does to a ship's material condition. The fire in Ford's laundry room was not intelligence. The Navy's decision to send it back to the Red Sea 5 days later was. The 5 days in Split created a paradox that the Virginia Senator's letter made explicit. 1945's analysis in March 2026 was direct. Between the fire damage, the deferred maintenance, and nearly 9 months of sustained high-tempo operations, there was a real risk the carrier could be out of action for an extended period, potentially as long as 12 to 14 months once it finally returned to Newport News Shipbuilding for its post-deployment availability. That 12 to 14-month figure represents the total accumulated bill: fire damage repair, EMALS system servicing, vacuum sewage system clearing, advanced weapons elevator recertification after sustained combat operations, structural inspection after 300-plus days of flight operations, and the full selected restricted availability that the ship was already overdue for before the fire started. 5 days in Split addressed the fire damage. It did not address the maintenance backlog. It could not. A 5-day port call at a Croatian commercial pier does not provide the industrial capability of a U.S. naval shipyard. There is no floating dry dock in Split capable of inspecting the Ford's hull below the waterline. There is no depot-level maintenance facility capable of servicing the EMALS system. There is no supply chain capable of delivering the specialized components that a Ford-class carrier's maintenance cycle requires from a pier in the Adriatic. What Split provided was emergency repair. Smoke damage cleared. Destroyed berthing made minimally habitable. 1945 reported that the Navy stripped mattresses from USS John F. Kennedy, the still unfinished second Ford-class carrier at Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia, and shipped them to Croatia to replace what the fire destroyed aboard her commissioned sister. The mattresses on Ford's restored berths came from a ship that isn't finished yet. That sentence contains the entire state of the carrier industrial base in the spring of 2026 in 17 words. Newport News Shipbuilding, the only U.S. yard capable of building nuclear carriers, is simultaneously trying to finish the Ford class's second hull, service the Ford-class's first hull during the shortest port call of its deployment, and maintain the production and overhaul queue for the rest of the nuclear fleet. The mattress transfer was not a logistics improvisation. It was a snapshot of an industrial base operating beyond its recovery margin. The Navy declared Ford Combat ready on the 5th day and sent it back to the Red Sea. The deeper problems were deferred again. They did not disappear. They accumulated, compounding against every subsequent day of flight operations and weapon loads and steam generation and crew endurance. Senators Warner and Caney's March 19th letter to Secretary of the Navy, John Phelan, asked questions that the public deserved answers to, and that the operational pressures of an active war had prevented anyone from answering honestly. They described a ship that, despite its $13 billion cost, was failing to provide basic quality of life standards. They noted persistent sewage failures, inoperable laundry facilities, a deployment schedule that shifts without warning. They asked specifically how Ford's extension would affect the maintenance schedule for the entire CVN program, because the shipyard that would repair Ford is the same shipyard servicing other carriers, and extended deployments that delay maintenance create backlogs that cascade through the entire fleet's readiness cycle. The Navy's limited dry dock capacity for nuclear carriers is concentrated at 3 locations: Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia, Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in Washington, and Norfolk Naval Shipyard. Reagan was already at Puget Sound. Truman and Eisenhower were at or approaching Norfolk. The moment Ford returned to Newport News for its full availability, it would join a queue that was already absorbing multiple carriers simultaneously, and the availability period for a ship with Ford's maintenance backlog would be longer than the post-deployment availabilities of comparable Nimitz-class vessels, because every system on the Ford class is first of kind, meaning every maintenance procedure requires the same engineering analysis that characterized the ship's troubled development program. The senators warned that the extended deployment was handicapping future readiness by delaying much-needed maintenance. That warning described a real and measurable risk. A carrier that enters a 12 to 14-month availability in 2026 does not return to operational status until late 2027 or early 2028. That is a carrier-sized hole in the deployment rotation for nearly 2 years, during which the same carriers that covered for Ford during its record deployment would be covering for its extended maintenance period, with their own maintenance backlogs accumulating from the additional load. The administration's operational calculus was defensible. Keeping 3 carriers in CENTCOM during an active air campaign was the decision that enabled 13,000 sorties and the strategic results the campaign achieved. The alternative, sending Ford home at the cost of having theater coverage in March, was not a serious option while the strait remained contested. What the operational math did not fully account for was the compounding nature of the maintenance debt. The 12 to 14-month availability estimate was made before Ford ran an additional 60 days of high-tempo operations after split. Every day added to the deployment adds scope to the Newport News availability, which extends its duration, which extends the hole in the rotation, which extends the load on the carriers covering for it. The senators called it handicapping future readiness. That is not a political phrase. It is a description of a feedback loop where one extended deployment generates the structural conditions for the next one. On May 1, 2026, day 311 of a deployment that began June 24, 2025, Ford transited the Suez Canal northbound. The War Zone's carrier tracker confirmed it on May 3rd. The historic deployment of the Gerald R. Ford CSG appears to be winding down, finally. The strike group reportedly began the journey home to Norfolk. After 314 days, the longest continuous U.S. carrier deployment since the Vietnam War, the ship was finally heading home. Not because the strategic situation had changed enough to release it, because Project Freedom launched with 2 carrier strike groups, Lincoln and Bush in the Arabian Sea together, generating the minimum coverage CENTCOM required for the mission. 2 carriers providing the umbrella that Project Freedom needed meant 1 carrier could finally leave. The maintenance bill that Ford is carrying to Newport News is not yet publicly quantified. The fire damage, the sewage system, the EMALS intervals, the AWE certifications, the structural inspection, the full SRA that was already overdue when the fire started. 1945's 12 to 14-month estimate was made before Ford ran an additional 60 days of high-tempo operations after split. The final number is larger than what March's analysis projected. The ship that could not come home after the fire is finally going home in May. The Navy's most advanced carrier, which cost $13 billion to build and 10 years to get operational, will spend the better part of the next year in a shipyard being rebuilt from the accumulated cost of 9 months at the edge of its engineering margins. That is not what the Navy planned when Ford deployed from Norfolk on June 24, 2025. It is what 9 months of continuous operations, a laundry fire, a 5-day patch job in Croatia, and a theater that had no replacement produce when the bill finally comes due. 314 days, 4 theaters, 1 fire in a laundry room, no enemy action required. 5 days in Croatia with mattresses from a ship in Virginia that isn't finished yet, and a maintenance bill of 12 to 14 months waiting at Newport News for the most expensive carrier ever built. A carrier that couldn't come home because the fleet had nothing to replace it with. Beijing noted the deployment record. Newport News will calculate the bill. And the next carrier that can't come home will point back to this one. That's enemy decoded.